I'm Dr. Mike. So we've just talked about how to create your own bread recipe, and that is helpful for all different types of bread. I wanted to get into baking. So why don't we go ahead and we will start first with a no-knead bread. This is the bread that my wife thinks is the most tasty and she absolutely loves it. It's very, very simple, and so I thought I would start with this simple recipe first, and then we'll get into a little bit more complexity by doing artisan bread next. Artisan bread has all of the classic steps of bread making. We're going to skip a couple of those with this recipe in this no-knead bread, but I hope you really enjoy this. This is a fun bread. So the first thing that we are going to do, the first thing that we always start with is our starter. I'm going to make this bread in an 8-quart Dutch oven, and I find that if you're going to use an 8-quart Dutch oven, you use about 8 cups of flour. If you're going to use a 5-quart Dutch oven, use 5 cups of flour, and the water ratio here is half the water to flour. So if I'm using 8 cups of flour, I'm using 4 cups of water. 5 cups of flour, I'm using 2.5 cups of water, and so forth. Now I'm going to do this by weight because we talked before about how weight is the most accurate, and it is. So I'm going to do this by weight. We talked about using about 65% hydration for an artisan loaf of sourdough bread. Because this is a no-knead sourdough bread, we're going to push that hydration higher. So we're going to use a recipe that I created that uses about 75% hydration. Okay, and this is good for this particular recipe is this 75% hydration. So let's get started. The first thing that we're going to do is take some of our very active bubbly starter, and we are going to put it in our mixer here. And so we're going to put in about a cup, which is about 200 grams of the starter. Okay, so there is 219, that's a little much, but again, you don't have to be too perfect on this. So there's about 205 grams of the starter, okay? And the next thing that we're going to add is water. And this recipe that I'm going to use, you can either use 4 cups of water. It turns out that's about 1,000 grams of water. So we're going to add, we just added 100 grams of water in the starter, so we're going to add an additional 900 grams in this recipe. So I'm going to take the water. The first thing I'm going to do is check the temperature with an instant read thermometer, and that measures exactly 80 degrees. If you can see that, it is 80 degrees on my instant read thermometer. Now I'm going to tear out my scale, so it reads 0, and I'm going to add 900 grams of the water. So there's 902 grams, so that's perfect. One of the things that you'll notice is that the starter is floating on the surface of the water. That's how that you can tell your starter is ready to be used, that it's active and bubbly and ready to be used, is that it floats on the surface of your water. So the next thing that we're going to add is flour, and we've already added, again, 100 grams of flour in the starter. So the next thing that we're going to do is add 1,225 more grams of flour directly into our mixture here. So this is bread flour, again about 13% protein content, and we're going to add 1,225 grams to create this loaf. 1,224 grams, 1,225 grams perfectly. So there is our flour and water mixture. Now for this no-knead recipe, we can go ahead and add the salt immediately without waiting like we normally do during the autolyse or autolyse portion of the bread making. So the next thing that we're going to do is add salt, and we're going to add, again, we've got 1,300, just over 1,300 grams of flour in our mixture. So based on our rule of 2% salt, we need exactly between 26 and 27 grams of salt. Okay, so here we're going to measure out Get as close to as we can to 26 grams. There's 27, that'll be just fine. So here's 27 grams of salt. We'll go ahead and add that straight into our mixture. And that's all we need in this step of the recipe. Okay, now that we've got all of our salt, flour, and water into one bowl, we're ready to mix it up. Now you can do this by hand because again, this is really a no-knead dough, but I'm gonna cheat and put it in the mixer, the stand mixer, because I have it here and because it'll make it go a little bit faster. So we'll put that in the stand mixer. I'm going to use a standard dough hook for that. And I'm simply going to put it on for about 2 minutes on a fairly medium speed, maybe 2 on my stand mixer for about 2 minutes and mix it until it's smooth. So we'll wait till it becomes smooth and then we'll transfer it over into a bowl so that the whole mixture can bulk ferment. Okay, we finished mixing our dough, and I want you to see what it looks like. So again, this is what the dough looks like. It's a wet dough. Remember, we're working with about 70% hydration dough here. So it's a wet dough, and it's going to allow for a nice, chewy, wonderful texture when all is said and done. Now, the next thing we want to do, if you think about it, what we've done here is we've put sourdough starter, which is a fermented substance, in with regular flour and water, and we've put it in at about 80 degrees. The bulk of the water is 80 degrees. And what we want to have happen is over about the next 7 hours or so, we want that sourdough starter to start breaking down all of that wheat protein that we just added. And that's a process called bulk fermentation. Okay, so the next 7 hours is going to be this process of bulk fermentation, and we're going to do it in a proving bowl like this. Okay, so what I'm going to do once it's done bulk fermenting, we're going to transfer it into the Dutch oven. But I want there to be as much air left in the dough as possible. So I'm going to just spray my proving bowl a little bit with a little canola cooking spray, just so that dough can come out easier, and we don't lose all of that air in the transformation or in the transfer process. So I've got this wet dough. I'm going to take a dough scraper, and we're just going to scrape that right out into this mixing bowl for bulk fermentation. Now again, the key too is once it's in that bowl, we want to make sure it doesn't dry out over the next several hours. And so what we're going to do is either cover it with just a little bit of cellophane, or better yet, if you can save the cellophane and just cover it with a little bowl lid like this, and that will keep that dough very moist and ready. So we'll check in on this in 7 hours and we'll see what's happened to the dough. Let's look at it one last time. This is what it looks like now, and then we're going to check in on it in 7 hours and see how it rises in 7 hours and how it ferments, and then we'll go on to the next step, which will be the proving stage before we actually cook it. Okay, so we have waited about 7 hours for our bread to bulk ferment. Let's take a look and see what that looks like. So you can see that's probably tripled in size from our original dough, and that is just perfect. You can see how aerated it is, lots of air in there, and the bulk fermentation has occurred. Now what we want to do is transfer this dough into the Dutch oven and then prove it in the Dutch oven, and finally we'll cook it in the Dutch oven and we'll be done. So the next thing we're going to do is transfer this dough. The reason we sprayed the bowl originally is that we want to keep as much of that air in the dough as possible, but we're going to knock a lot out. So here's our enameled Dutch oven. Again, we like canola cooking spray because the bread tends to come out very easily after you use a little bit of canola cooking spray. We found that other things like avocado oil and olive oil don't work quite as well. So we simply give a light dusting of the cooking spray to the enamel Dutch oven, and then we're going to pour this dough out into the Dutch oven. Okay, so you can see what that looks like. And what we're going to do now is we're going to allow this dough to prove until it doubles in size. And once it doubles in size, it takes about 3 more hours at room temperature. Then we're going to bake it. So we're going to cover it in the meantime, and we'll take a look in 3 more hours. Okay, we are on to our last and final step for the no-knead sourdough bread. We have gone through the step of bulk fermentation in the proving bowl. For the last 3 hours, the dough has been in the Dutch oven proving, and let's take a look and see what the dough looks like. So the dough looks just perfect. It's doubled in size from where it was originally. You can see there's some nice bubbles in there. It's a very aerated, beautiful bread, and it's going to turn out just great. So the last thing we're going to do is bake it. Before we bake it, I want to make just a quick note on proving bread. Proving bread is very dependent on the temperature of your kitchen. It would be ideal if we could always prove sourdough bread at about 80 degrees, but of course, nobody has a kitchen that's 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And so there are a couple of things we can do. We can prove it at a lower temperature for a longer time. The longer you prove the sourdough bread, the more sour it becomes, the more flavorful it becomes. And so you can prove it for a longer time. I will often, with this no-knead recipe, I will prove it until it gets a certain point in the Dutch oven where I know it's ready to cook. The other thing you can do is raise the temperature in your kitchen by either, sometimes I'll put a mug of water in the microwave. I'll boil it for 1 minute, and then I'll just set the dough in with the hot water in the microwave, and that will raise the temperature, and that will allow for quicker proving. Now, one of the things about proving too quickly is that you'll lose, if you prove too quickly, you'll lose some of the flavor in the bread when all is said and done. So sometimes it's better to let it prove over a longer period of time. We can even sometimes prove, as we do the artisan loaves, you'll see that we prove the bread for up to 24 hours and sometimes longer in order to get that really wonderful flavor. So right now, the bread has this wonderful smell. It's got that nice sourdough smell, and let's go ahead and put it in the oven. So I've got my oven set at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're going to put it in the oven with the lid on for 30 minutes. And then we'll come back in 30 minutes and we'll take the lid off and we'll cook it for another 30 minutes. The internal temperature of bread should be between 195 and about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. If it reaches 195 degrees internal temperature, it's perfectly cooked. And so this is again why an instant read thermometer is so helpful. So let's we'll take one last look at in a half an hour, and then we'll have our final loaf of bread. It's been a half an hour, so let's go ahead and take the lid off our bread, and then we'll cook it for another half an hour. All right, it's been an hour and our bread's ready to come out of the oven. So let's go see what the internal temperature is first. Again, it should be between 195 and 205 degrees. So we're gonna simply place the thermometer in the bread. Comes out at 196 degrees, which is just perfect, and the bread's ready to come out. My wife bought me these wonderful long oven mitts because I was burning my forearms coming in and out of the oven. These are terrific. Bring the bread out. It looks great. I'm going to plop it right down on the drying rack, and then we'll turn it over. And there is our no-knead sourdough bread, with just an incredible texture. I wish you could smell it right now. It smells so good. And the best thing to do when you get bread out of the oven is let it rest for at least an hour before you cut into it. So we'll cut into it soon and enjoy it, and I hope you enjoy the recipe.